what Descartes started with was the idea that you could do the following. You could imagine that you are thinking and you are having all kinds of experiences, conscious experiences is what we'd say nowadays, sensory experiences. You can also be thinking abstractly, but you can imagine that being the case while there is no physical world at all, while bodies do not exist. So for instance, you could imagine that your mind exists, your thinking happens, and maybe God exists, but there are no bodies at all. And that for Descartes was a starting point for an argument for dualism, because he thought that that shows that our mental states, our thinking, is really something different from what you can find in the physical world. That's the central idea of the argument.
Are they one thing? Consciousness is the brain? Or are they two separate things? Consciousness and the brain are separate. And if they're two separate things, what's the connection between them? Do they interact? Does the brain cause consciousness? Does consciousness cause goings on in the brain? If they do interact, how do they interact? All those questions are aspects of the mind-body problem. Many, many arguments have been put forward for this over the years, but my own view is that consciousness is not reducible to a process in the brain. There's more to consciousness than a physical process in the brain.
Sometimes nowadays people say, mental states are just brain states. And then I feel really puzzled. I wonder what those people are like from the inside, as it were. Because when I think about my own experiences, my conscious experiences, like when I feel pain or when I see red or I smell chocolate, for instance, those experiences seem so different from what people talk about when they talk about brain states, that I have real difficulty with the idea that my conscious experiences would just be brain states.
It's a long story, but I'm inclined to think there's a principled gap between anything you get out of the neuroscience, anything you get from a description of a physical process, and the first-person story about consciousness. One way to bring it out, and you can make this into an argument if you like, is to say for any story you tell about the brain, you can at least conceive of all that going on without any consciousness at all. All these brain processes, no consciousness. That suggests that the story about the brain processes alone doesn't fully explain consciousness. You need to add something to the story to explain why it is that when you have these brain processes, you have consciousness.
The research that I do is really trying to understand what are the brain mechanisms that give rise to all of the different behaviours that we're familiar with. Attention, memory, language, higher cognitive thinking, and so on and so forth. One of the things in particular we're interested in at the moment is trying to understand how might attentional processes influence brain plasticity. So, brain plasticity is something that's ongoing in most of us. The brain changes in response to its environment, and we want to know to what extent might attentional processes regulate brain plasticity in the same way that attention regulates how we perceive the world around us. The difficult thing as an experimentalist is trying to harness the subjective aspects of experience. As a psychologist, I'm very interested in understanding when people perceive something. I want to know the rich detail, but it's actually quite hard to quantify that. And so inevitably in experimental science, what we end up doing is having to develop much more austere kinds of processes and paradigms to help us unpack what might be the brain mechanisms for conscious awareness or for attention and so on and so forth. So I do think that neuroscience, we're really still at a very early stage, and I think that neuroscience has much more to offer in terms of understanding processes like attention and like consciousness, and maybe even the apparent gap between them. And I think, the next decades will help us see just how far neuroscience can go.
The problem of consciousness is a problem about subjective experience, how it feels from the inside, and what generates the problem is it seems that explaining all the behavior you like isn't going to explain why it is that we're conscious. We can imagine all those complex behaviors going on without consciousness. So there's a further kind of problem in the case of consciousness. I mean, when people talk about consciousness, they sometimes call the problems of explaining all the behaviors, the things I do, the things I say. Those are the easy problems. When it comes to consciousness, there's this further problem of experience that we call the hard problem. It's distinctive precisely because it doesn't reduce to a question of explaining behavior. Now, one trouble with the mind-body problem is basically every view has serious costs. So in my own work, I've tried to look at ways of trying to show these costs are not fatal, that maybe there's a form of epiphenomenalism where all this makes sense. Maybe there are some potential mechanisms for consciousness to affect the physical world. But the fact is nobody right now has any kind of consensus story on how this interaction might happen.
One thing that's important about Descartes that he was committed to mechanistic conception, a mechanistic conception of the physical world, and that meant that the physical world consists of myriads, indefinitely many tiny particles that have shapes and sizes and motions, and everything in the physical world is to be explained in terms of that. But Descartes thought that the mind is just something very, very different from that and can't be explained in terms of these mechanical processes. And so that divide in nature between body and mind, that was really at the heart of his dualism. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm also, I guess, quite sympathetic to the idea that it's going to be very difficult to get a scientific explanation for subjective experience. I can taste coffee or smell a rose or see the color red, and I know what I'm experiencing and I know how to describe it. I know you can do the same thing, but I can never really get into your head and see how you're perceiving the world. And with the tools we currently have in neuroscience, there really is no way of doing that. We can record brain activity in individuals. We can correlate that back with behavior and back with subjective experience, but in the end it's always a kind of correlation, and as we know, correlation is not causation.
Descartes thought that animals were able to, perhaps were able to respond to stimuli, but that they didn't really have anything like consciousness, that they were in particular unable to reason. And that we would probably have machines that could do the kinds of things animals do when we just develop clockwork a bit more, but we would never have machines that could think. And the amazing thing is that almost 4 centuries later, when we actually do have machines, they're still very bad at doing the things that animals can do most easily, like seeing and walking and running. But they're much better than we are at doing a certain kind of thinking. And that kind of thinking is one of 2 sorts of mental activity that we include, I think, in the most general sense of thinking. It is the analytic kind of thinking, which typically uses language, which is explicit, which proceeds slowly, methodically, one sentence at a time, according to well-defined rules, and in which, since it includes mathematics and scientific knowledge, in which we find the way to get to the moon. Nobody would ever have gotten to the moon by what we call the seat of our pants. And the seat of our pants kind of thinking represents the other kind of thinking, which is much closer to what animals close to us, our cousins, other primates and other mammals, can do.